Hi, Helen. Thank you for joining me today on Net Zero Compare.
Thank you. Thanks so much for joining me, Carol.
My pleasure. You are the founder of HN Communications, a sustainability communications consultancy, and more recently, the creator of Zena, an AI pre publication governance platform designed to help corporate sustainability teams review sustainability claims before they go public. I think it's a very timely topic because companies are under growing pressure to communicate their sustainability work clearly, but they are also facing more scrutiny from regulators, customers, investors, and the media. For many teams, the challenge is no longer what just to say, but how to make sure every public claim is accurate, supported, and appropriate for the market where it appears. So today, I would like to discuss the practical side of sustainability communications, greenwashing risk, greenhushing, internal review processes, and how companies can build more reliable systems before content reaches the public. So, Helen, to start, could you briefly walk us through your background and what led you to focus specifically on sustainability communications and greenwashing risk?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Carol. So, my background is a bit of a strange one in that I actually started out my career in politics and I worked in the British Parliament for several years, working for some politicians. And I came from a background that focused much more on defence and international relations, but a lot around regulation. So, I come from that kind of regulatory political world, I guess. And then I moved into corporate maybe about 20 years ago now. And I worked in the corporate world for quite some time, working for global corporates, but on the side of regulation and governance. So my job was very much about engaging with governments all over the globe on behalf of companies like Virgin Atlantic and then latterly Nissan to help them kind of navigate the political and policy worlds that were impacting them as a business. So you can imagine, I think both with airlines and with the automotive world, they are quite heavily regulated. And of course, there's a lot of challenge around carbon and pollutants. And so inevitably, my job took me into much more of a sustainability space from a regulatory point of view. But I then left the corporate world around 10 years ago to set up my own company. It was never really my intention to kind of get into regulation or indeed sustainability per se. I set up a communications agency, but what we found was that so much of the skills that we had, we just kept getting asked to help in these areas, particularly on sustainability and particularly on the regulatory side of things. So much more in that kind of corporate affairs, political world, but how do these companies, how do our clients navigate those kinds of challenges? So sustainability has kind of followed me through, but I have fallen in love with it. It is an area that I'm deeply passionate about, and I think businesses can be a real force for good when they do it in the right way. So around about a year or so ago, we noticed that definitely some of our clients were continuing to struggle with how to communicate on sustainability. We've seen a real transition, I think, in the past 2 years. We've seen a lot of political change, and that political change has driven organizations to think about how they stand on sustainability and how they communicate on it, for one. We've also seen growing regulatory pressure from different governments and institutions, particularly in Europe and UK, raising the stakes in terms of the potential risks around getting it wrong. And so I think this has all elevated the challenges that I think companies and organizations feel in terms of how best to communicate. So that is exactly why we then looked at AI and all of our skill set and how we might bring those together to help our clients a little bit more. And hence that's how Zena was born.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I think that gives a very useful context, especially because sustainability communication now sits at the intersection of regulation, reputation, and business strategy. So let's move from your background into the problem companies are facing today. Because a few years ago, many companies were encouraged to speak more openly about their sustainability commitments, and now I think many seem much more cautious. And from your perspective, what changed and why has communicating sustainability become so much harder nowadays?
You're absolutely right to sort of suggest that there has been this shift and change. And it's funny, isn't it? A good 5 years ago, when we were working in this space, I think businesses and organizations were almost tripping over themselves to come out with the most ambitious statement and to get the kind of biggest applause, really, for their levels of commitment. And I think in some ways, that's not a bad thing, but commitments on its own, we know, are quite hollow. And of course, time has gone on and there's a requirement for some of those businesses to fulfill some of those commitments. I think also what's happened, as I mentioned a moment ago, there has been a massive political shift. And I don't think we can deny that in the past 2 years, the change in US government and the refocus around away from net zero and away from focusing on the kind of green agenda has meant that businesses have had to realign themselves. I think some have done so and breathes a sigh of relief potentially. But I actually think the vast majority of them have said, okay, well, we see the change in political shift, but we know these investments take much longer than just a couple of years. And we know we want to continue on this path. So what I've seen is that investment hasn't necessarily stopped, but how a business has started to communicate all of that level of kind of work and focus has definitely changed. And I think alongside that, we've seen this growth of the kind of regulatory force, particularly in certain areas of the globe, have meant that businesses have become more cautious. So we've seen this phenomenon called greenhushing that I guess we'll come on to in a moment, where businesses are much less willing to speak openly about the work they're doing around sustainability. And that in itself is a problem. Part of that is being driven by a lack of confidence and concern of getting it wrong. And I think there is another portion that we can't deny where there is a worry that they may say something that could cause kind of political offense, particularly in certain markets. So again, this cautiousness about how they talk about it has certainly changed. So we've seen language shift. I think that was one of the big things we saw quite quickly, particularly with some of the American clients that we work with, where we've gone from this sense of altruism that working in the ambition to become net zero is something that is the right thing to do, to a point where businesses are now looking at it as a business case. And so words like resilience and long-term planning and security within your supply chain have really elevated within that space of sustainability communications. And actually some of that altruism and that desire to do the right thing has definitely lowered. And I think there is definitely a case to say that there's no coincidence that some of that political language has filtered through into how businesses feel comfortable about talking about sustainability now.
And that distinction between communicating progress and exposing the company to risk, I think is important. It also leads directly to the issue many teams are trying to avoid, which is greenwashing. And that brings us to the next question, because I was thinking when people hear greenwashing, they often think of obvious exaggeration or dishonest marketing. This is what comes to my mind first. But in practice, many cases seem more subtle. In your view, what are the most common greenwashing risks and you see in corporate sustainability communications?
I mean, I think the first thing to say is that I don't believe that any business or organization sets out to intentionally greenwash. And therefore, I think that the challenge with greenwashing is that often it is done accidentally. It is not intended in any way, shape, or form, but there are some areas, I think, that are fractured within business that cause this risk to be greater. So let me explain what I mean. Within a usual kind of corporate or business style environment, you will have a sustainability team, you'll have a marketing team, you'll have a corporate affairs team, you might have a legal team. All of them are separate, but all of them are critical to ensuring that process doesn't happen around greenwashing. And essentially what greenwashing is when a business makes a claim around its sustainability credentials, but isn't actually giving the background and the data and the information to back it up. So we always say to people that we work with, you have to think about sustainability information in the same way that you would treat your financial data. It requires that same level of rigor. But what has happened to date is I think sometimes, whether it's a marketing department might take the lead, or the PR side, which doesn't have the same level of rigor and accountability perhaps that a legal or a finance team might have. They tend to kind of put the best message forward, but without all of the backing and the information to kind of support that statement. And it's at that point where most businesses get tripped up with greenwashing. So there's a real disconnect between these departments. And I genuinely think that, with every intention, lots of businesses traditionally have always communicated in a way that puts their business or their product in the best light. And that's absolutely fine. But when it comes to sustainability, that's absolutely the opposite of how you need to approach it, because the moment you do that without all of that rigor and data and support behind it, that is the moment that you get caught with greenwashing. So there's some disconnect, I think, within the structures of business currently that don't lend itself to communicating in sustainability in the best way. And I think that's why a lot of businesses are getting tripped up.
Thank you very much for that perspective. I think it's very useful reminder that risk can come from vague wording, missing context, or weak evidence, not only from intentional false claims, as I thought. So let's look at the other side of the problem as well, because there is also the issue of greenwashing, where companies become so worried about criticism that they avoid communicating about sustainability at all. We've observed such cases with our clients a few times already. So how should companies think about the balance between saying too much, saying too little, and maybe saying what can actually be supported?
You're absolutely right. So I think what tends to happen is greenhushing, if you think about it, is almost like the mirror image of greenwashing. And we have seen this rise over the past couple of years. Businesses have grown very cautious and believe that it's actually better to say nothing because that will avoid any risk at all. But in actual fact, there is issues with greenhushing as well. Not communicating any data is a problem because there are requirements on businesses, particularly over a certain size, to report on a lot of this data. There is an expectation from investors as well that you are sharing this data. So you need to be able to communicate this information in a way that is safe, that is credible, but you do need to do it. Equally, we mustn't forget, a lot of these businesses are putting a huge amount of investment into transitioning away from fossil fuels. And so it doesn't make any sense with all of that level of investment to still stay silent on all of the good work that is being done. I don't think that's good for them. I don't think it's good for their wider sector. The way in which businesses are progressing is when they understand the knowledge between different sectors and of how they are transitioning to a net zero world. So I think what has to happen is businesses need to start to feel more comfortable and more confident with best practice approaches of how to communicate on sustainability. We've seen that when businesses feel more confident, when they feel empowered, that they know what is the right thing to do and what is the wrong thing to do, they start to feel more able to communicate on this. So I think there's a big knowledge gap that is lacking perhaps in some of those internal departments to really improve that level of confidence. Because I think with that level of confidence, we do see that businesses do start to be much more vocal. And those ones that are vocal, we see them and their products actually growing in brand reputation and likability, and thus their profits grow. So there are definite correlations and benefits to businesses speaking on sustainability, but doing so in the right way.
You've just mentioned the internal governance, and I think this is where internal governance starts to matter, and is very important because striking this balance is difficult, especially for companies that are doing real work but are unsure how to present it responsibly. And let's now switch to internal review before content goes public, because this is what also those internal governance teams are meant to do. So let's say before a sustainability claim appears in an annual report, a website, a campaign, or a product page, or even a social media post, what should a good internal review process look like in your view?
So I think with anything like that, I think looking at your data and having a look at your report and getting all of that information together in the right way and it's accurate is definitely the first place to start. But there is a point, as you rightly point out, between having your internal data and your reporting and your information and how you then transition that information into a point that is engaging and clear and supporting the kind of narrative of your business, but also doing it in a safe way. So this pre-publication stage is the piece where we've been really fascinated and interested by. I think with the work that we've been doing with our clients over the past 10 years, we've seen that this is that area where that's the real crunch point. It's not necessarily all of the data banks and the information and the data that you've got sitting within your business, but it's how you then translate that ready for an external world. And it's at that point where we see that level of risk intensify. So the best thing to do, and one of the things that we've kind of looked at before we set up and built the AI tool, was to sit with our clients and look at the content and the language and use a level of best practice where we look at things like, are all of your claims verified by third party? Do you have the data to back up the claim? Have you got real world examples to show how you have done this in practice? If you're making a statement around your progress, can you show the steps you have taken to get to where you are today? So these are just some very basic things to think about when we sit down with our clients and we kind of help them with how they get that messaging ready for a public audience. What we've done with Zena is to make sure that we've put all of those kind of global regulations and EU regulations that are coming on board into a one place where you can then input all of your pre-publication content. You might be drafting it or you might be putting that press release together. And the system will analyze that information and look at it from a whole global context of where you might be at potential regulatory risk when it comes to greenwashing. It will then show you where that risk is within your content, but then it will coach the user to think about those things like I just said, whether you need to bring in more data to back up your statement, whether you need to clarify who was the third-party verifier to be able to support that claim. So it will coach the user to start thinking about these things, because what we wanted to do is really empower more businesses, more people to feel as though they have the confidence and the clarity to be able to then reshape their language so that it is ready for publication. So that was one of the big things that we saw was definitely a problem that we saw clients struggling with. And we thought, you know what, we can take all of our best practice work, we can take all of the global regulation, we can build an AI platform around that to really help more of our clients be able to be more empowered to do it themselves.
So you've already answered my next question in part, I would say, because I was just about to mention that you create Zena as an AI pre-publication governance platform. And as I understand, for corporate sustainability teams, especially for them. So what specific gap were you trying to solve, and what were companies struggling with before a tool like this existed? Was it what you've just described, translating the thoughts, translating their commitments into a public discourse, into a public news for those companies, or it was something more?
I think it was something more. I think it was almost something deeper than that. I saw that there were so many of our clients, particularly working in the sustainability space, that felt very unconfident and unsure as to how to tell their story and how to tell their story in a way that was both safe and credible at the same time. I think it's very easy, potentially, to put out sustainability information that is very dry, full of data, but it doesn't really say anything. So you run the risk of being able to put information out there that might be credible, that might give all of the data sets, but there's nothing to actually hold the story to that actually resonates with an external audience. So it goes nowhere. And we've all seen those company reports, those sustainability reports that are put on the 8th page of a website that nobody ever reads. So I think that can often be a massive waste for business. So that's on one side. And I think on the other side, there's a need, I think, for a lot of those teams to be able to think about how do they embed sustainability into other aspects of the organization, and how do they use the information that they have but be able to tell the story in creative ways. And so I think what the tool is able to do is not only give that confidence back to person writing around the sustainability content, but also be able to give them an elevated story, because it will help, decide where you might need to bring in a real world example and a case study. And we're all about trying to encourage our clients to tell those real world stories, because they bring the sustainability element to life, and they are the things that resonate with people. So we really want the communication to do the right thing, but we also want the story to resonate as well, so that the company does get that level of elevation and recognition for the work that they're doing as well. So I think it works in both ways. And I think what we were surprised about is we always had assumed that people would put information into it that already existed. But what we found is that a lot of our clients using it want to use it as a free-form tool. They start to test out some of the work that they're doing, that they're drafting, whether it's a report or whether it's a position paper to their board. They're testing it out in real world form to be able to kind of sense check whether they're on the right path. And actually, interestingly, what that's done is we've seen that that's helped make an improvement to those individuals to get better in this space themselves. And I think that ability for the tool to really empower people to be better in this space is definitely one of the unexpected joys that we've found in this, because I think it is giving back that confidence to people that they didn't have.
And we both know how storytelling is very important. So I think Zena found a really great gap in the market over here. And also, thank you very much for those examples. I think that helps explain why this is more than just a communications tool. I think it is really about reducing risk before something becomes public. So let's go deeper into how that review actually works. Because Zena reviews sustainability claims against frameworks such as the EU Green Claims Directive. I also noted down the UK Competition and Markets Authority Green Claims Code, or the US Federal Trade Commission Green Guides, and the EU Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, and also the EU Empowering Consumers for the Green Transition Directive. So in practical terms, if you could tell us how different are these frameworks and what does that mean for a company communicating across multiple markets?
So I think you almost hit the nail on the head there, actually, because even with just listing out some of those regulations, and actually the Green Claims Directive has been put on hold by the EU quite recently, and it's almost been superseded by this other one, the European Consumer Green Transition
There
Directive,
you
or the
are.
ECGT. Yeah. So, and I think this also illustrates an important point here. There are a multitude of regulations out there, primarily coming from Europe, UK, US, some parts of Asia and Oceania and Australia, so that kind of area. But we are seeing others bubbling up in different parts. And I think the important thing is that if you are a global company and you're operating in multiple markets, it's extremely confusing right now to know where you can say the right thing, or is it the right thing? So I think there's a level of confusion. And I think this doesn't seem to be changing anytime soon, that there will be any cohesiveness within a lot of these regulations, because they are all very different and they're slightly nuanced. And I think that nuanced is also interesting if you are operating in multiple languages as well. So it does carry a huge amount of, I think, complexity that becomes very difficult. And of course, that feeds back into all of those problems we were just talking about in terms of lack of confidence. When it becomes too complex, too potentially risky and difficult, people step back and they decide not to communicate at all. So what Zena does is it enables having all of these regulations in one place. It allows you to be able to kind of self-select. So you may just be an organization that simply operates in Europe. That's fine. Then you can just look at the European regulations to see how that impacts you in that market. But I think all of these regulations, if I was to be pushed on it, I think are looking for verification and validation of the statements that you are making. And I think even if you don't go down the path of using a tool like Zena and you want to think about what best practice is, I think as long as you are always asking yourself against all of these regulations, the point is, have you verified and can you back up the statements that you are making? And can you provide all of that data and information? And if you can you make sure that that information that you are providing has also been verified by a third party? That is essentially, I think, what most of the regulations are trying to achieve in some sort of way. So there is a level of transparency and rigor that has been set against any statement or claim that you are making. So I think that's probably the general thread, but each of them carry very specific nuances and perspectives and differences depending on which regulation that you are looking at. And of course, sometimes that's what it does come down to, is some very specific differences. You know, we saw with KLM, there was a court case around them where they got fined because one of their campaigns was implying it was called Fly Responsibly, and it came down to the fact that the argument was that actually you can't fly responsibly, so that claim was unfair. And so sometimes these things do come down to nuance, and I think that's part of the challenge here for a lot of people.
So, as I thought that cross-market angle is especially relevant for companies operating internationally, like KLM you've mentioned, because I think a claim that feels acceptable in one market may need different evidence or even wording somewhere else. And
Absolutely.
exactly, so that might be the biggest problem. And now let's talk about the evidence behind the claims. A sustainability claim is only as strong as the evidence behind it, I would say so. So, what types of evidence should companies have ready before they make claims about, let's say, emissions, product impact, climate targets, circularity, or broader ESG performance, which is environmental, social, and governance?
So I think there's a few things to think about here that, again, should always be in your kind of mental checklist when you're looking at your own content. So are is what you're claiming, is the scope defined? Have you got some definable boundaries of how you are making that claim or that statement? So think about things like, is there a credible baseline? Do you have a clear methodology? Like I said before, do you have things like third-party verification where it is relevant? That is important. I know Ryanair got caught, for example, primarily because with the claims they were making, whilst they were actually fine, they hadn't got their statements third-party verified, and then they got fined for it. So there are some things around that third-party verification that are super important for certain aspects. Other things like your targets, you know, companies that are setting targets, making sure you've got these interim milestones and that you have a clear delivery plan as to how you are reaching each of those milestones rather than just thinking about the pure end state. So that roadmap and being able to talk about that is important. And then I think anything around your sort of product or circularity claims, thinking about things like the life cycle of the product, and being very clear on that in terms of its kind of recyclability and that sort of thing. Um, and anything around, and it's not necessarily a regulatory risk, but I do strongly advise as well that we think about real world examples of proof. Proof is a really important factor in terms of illustrating some of those claims that you are making. So making sure you have all the data, absolutely. But if you can show real world proof of how that is working, and I always like to encourage, even with those real world examples, do not admit the elements that didn't go so well. You know, avoid the temptation of being able to just tell a good news story, because we know sustainability is not like that. And in actual fact, credibility goes up for a company when an organization is honest and they say, we didn't get this right, or this didn't work, so we're trying this instead. I think those are the things of that real world honesty that actually elevate kind of brand acceptance amongst the public. So trying to think about your case studies as well is super important, but doing so in a way that is very humble and honest rather than trying to position it as a sales pitch is definitely the way forward.
Thank you very much for those examples. I think this is a very practical point for sustainability and compliance teams. I'm hoping they are listening to us right now. And the public sentence, I think, may be short, but the evidence behind it always requires much deeper internal processes. And this is something what customers cannot see. They will only see this as a short banner or a short phrase that company try to communicate, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So now let's connect that to how teams actually work day to day. Because green claims often involve several teams: sustainability, legal, marketing, product, procurement, and I would even say sometimes finance or investors' relations as well. So, where do you usually see friction between these teams, and how can companies make the review process less painful, if possible?
Yeah. I think there is friction, and I touched upon it earlier where I've definitely seen, sustainability departments, marketing departments, legal teams, they don't always talk to each other, or they do so perhaps at the wrong points in the process. Where I have seen things work really well, if we just take the marketing and sustainability teams, we've seen this work extremely well when sustainability is brought on at the very start of a new marketing initiative or campaign development for a product or service. And so sustainability almost working hand in glove with marketing as they go through that strategy and development all the way through to completion actually works extremely well. And it isn't a constraint, actually. What we have seen is that sustainability provides some challenges into the development of a marketing campaign, but it can actually really enhance the creativity. And we've seen that with some of the clients that we've worked with, for example, one of the beer brands, Juba, with the bison and the thinking about the products back in 2018, it was a well-loved but local beer in Poland, and over a period of time, linking the bison, which is on the front of the brand, to biodiversity. And we know that the land for the bison within Poland was diminishing, and that there was a loss of biodiversity. That the beer brand built a campaign around building back that biodiversity for the bison and the local wildlife. And they collaborated with WWF. And that beer brand, through that ongoing campaign, built upon its brand reputation, on its creativity around telling that story, and also built up its the financial impact and its brand loyalty as well. So all of these things exponentially supported the growth of a brand, but it was all driven by thinking about sustainability within the marketing context at the very start. So where you can bring sustainability into that thinking from the get-go, that's where I see it work most successfully.
I really appreciate that example. I'm Polish, so I'm very familiar with the brand and also the whole promo campaign. Yes, we brought Rubr, which is a Polish bison, back, I think, after the Second World War. Right now, it's flourishing in the forests in the northern part of Poland.
Yeah, and it's a beautiful creature, but I think it works so beautifully with this beer brand because everyone understands the connection. It's a genuine connection. I think that's also what's really important. And it goes back to that initial collaboration between sustainability and marketing. Not all subjects, not all focus areas around sustainability are suited to every single product or service. So you do have to think about, where does a brand neatly fit into a sustainability objective, and how can that brand therefore champion that within its branding and in its DNA. And for some it doesn't work, for some it perhaps shouldn't, but for where it does, it can really work very beautifully, like this one. And it's a great beer as well.
Yeah, 100%. And I think it also resonated with the Polish society. I visited Poland maybe around 2 months ago, and the ads are still running. Now, let's look at what business decisions or business decision makers should do next. Because for a company that knows it needs to improve sustainability communications, but let's say does not yet have a mature review process, what are the first practical steps you would recommend them to do?
So I think the first practical steps are really to understand what it is you are doing as an organization when it comes to sustainability. And actually, sustainability is a very broad term. I think sometimes people assume that we are just talking about CO2 and carbon reduction. Sustainability has grown massively within the context of what it actually even means for an organization. And I think sustainability now thinks about everything from water resource management, risk and management within your supply chains, um, biodiversity, nature, and the resources around, in the world. But it also can look at things like social responsibility as well, and how your products and services are supporting society. So there's a much bigger remit. And I think what I tend to find when we're starting with a lot of organizations, they don't realize that actually they're doing a huge amount of good work already that would fit into that sustainability space. They just haven't equated it with that. So I think the first step is always to really look wholeheartedly at what you're doing as an organization. And you may find that many of the pieces of work or focus areas you're doing would actually fit into that sustainability space. Then within that, I think the next step is very much to try and think about what your objectives are around that and how you are recording and monitoring that progress. Have you set yourself some goals and some ambitions to get to a certain point by when? And if you have, how are you year on year recording that data and holding yourself to account? So that is probably the first step before you even get to the point around communicating. We always advocate that it is far better to make a start and say nothing. And that's coming from a communication specialist. Start and say nothing until you have made some level of progress and action. Once you have action, that is the point in which you could start really communicating. So I would resist the temptation to go all out first of all and really get your work together and your plan together and start to take some action, start to make some progress, start to collaborate with others, because I think doing this on your own is extremely difficult. So working with third parties, whether that's trade associations or whether that's NGOs supporting in particular areas of your sustainability. So starting to think in that space first before you step into the communications world. But when you do decide to step into the communications world, then that first space is around getting your data together and understanding where those stories are, the good and the bad, and not being afraid to be able to tell the whole picture. And I think that is really important. And I think once you have some of that together, that's at that point where you can start to work with your marketing teams, your legal teams, and to start to build that communication story piece and do so in a way that is responsible, keeping in mind all of those best practice principles that I talked about earlier around how you report some of that storytelling. So that would be really the first place to start. But I would also say, and I just make the point, where I see things work really well, we never go into an organization to try and convince them to do more in sustainability. That's not our role. And I see it as a bit of a fruitless task, in all honesty. You need to be in an organization where the board and the CEO and the leadership team are fully on board with this. And where I see this work really well is when sustainability isn't seen as an add-on department, but sustainability is something that is accountable across the whole business function. So whether that's HR, finance, marketing, all of them have a responsibility and KPIs linked to sustainability. That's when I really see the kind of dial turn and the motivation change, I think, for a business. So there are some practical pieces that I mentioned in terms of how you get started, but I also think at the same time, think about your leadership positioning and where you place sustainability within your organization as well, because that is really important.
It was a very good way to frame this as a manageable and actionable business process, I would say, rather than just an abstract reputational concern. And before we close, I would like to give you some space for anything we have not covered, unless we covered everything. Is there anything important we did not touch on that you think sustainability teams, especially communication teams or business leaders, should understand about the greenwashing risk, greenhushing, or let's say responsible sustainability communication?
So, the only thing I would just leave with is we've talked very much about the now, and I think that that's right. But I also think, in terms of, where is our future heading and the sort of the plan for that. And I think over the next 10 years, I'm genuinely quite hopeful. We live in a time where it feels very tumultuous and very uncertain. But I am actually quite hopeful. I'm seeing that a lot of businesses are putting lots of focus and investment into this space. They are realizing that this is a business imperative, that this is about long term business resilience, this is about security, this is about building a business for the long term and maintaining a legacy for those organizations well into the future. And that for me is something what sustainability is really about. And I believe that it is a long term business driver for success. So I think thinking about the bigger picture, I think, yes, there are challenges around, the regulatory environment at the moment and the need to communicate on this in a way that is with structure and rigor so that you don't get caught by the regulatory challenges. I don't think that's going away. But what I would hate to see is that businesses get so consumed and obsessed by not getting caught by regulation and forgetting to communicate on the inspirational stories of change and progress that they are making as a company. So I think these things do need to be balanced. So I think thinking about that space and that bigger picture, I think is also equally important so that we don't get too bogged down in the here and now and keep thinking also about the future, which I do think has the potential to be positive if we, go in the right trajectory.
I couldn't agree more. Helen, thank you for joining me today, and I really appreciate your time and insights you shared with us.
Likewise, Carol, thank you so much for having me. They were great questions.
Thank you. And this was a very practical conversation because many companies are trying to communicate sustainability progress while also avoiding vague claims, unsupported statements, and unnecessary regulatory or reputational risks. I think what stood out is that credible sustainability communication is not only about better wording, it also depends on evidence, internal review, clear ownership, and understanding of the rules in the different markets. So for anyone listening or reading, you can learn more about Helen's work through HN Communications and Zena. You can also visit netzerocompare.com for more interviews, articles, and practical resources on sustainability, ESG, climate technology, and compliance. And if you would like to stay updated, you can subscribe to our newsletter for free for regular updates on the tools, regulations, and market developments shaping this space. Thank you again.